All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to completely reframe how we look at the past. We spend so much time focusing on the big stuff, kings, battles, political treaties. But today, we're tossing all of that out the window to uncover the hidden hand of nature. We're going to dive into how the physical world has been silently pulling the strings of the human story. It's a pretty profound question, right? Who actually writes our history? We tend to think of human choices happening in a vacuum, like our ancestors just woke up one day and decided exactly how their societies would look. But what if the environment itself is the true author here? What if the ground beneath our feet and the skies above our heads are the actual forces shaping civilizations? Landscape historian Tom Williamson really hits the nail on the head with this idea. He points out that, yes, people in the past made choices, but those decisions were heavily constrained by the physical realities of their environment. They weren't just painting on a blank canvas. They were negotiating with nature literally every single day. So let's look at this in three parts, starting with the big picture. Macro, storms trapped in Scottish peat. To really grasp this whole negotiating with nature thing, we're starting on a massive scale with sweeping weather systems. Now, you might be wondering, how on earth do we track a storm that happened thousands of years ago? Well, nature leaves clues in some pretty unexpected places, like deep inside waterlogged Scottish bogs. Environmental archaeologists literally extracted a 6-meter deep core of peat from a place called Shubster. Think about this. Typical written records of storms only go back maybe 1,000 years. But this single core of mud gives us a continuous 8 millennia record of storm intensity, all the way back to the mid-Holocene period, 8,000 years ago. It even shows the recent spikes we've seen in the 20th century and predicts how storm tracks are going to shift northward in our current 21st century. Okay, to make sense of all that ancient mud data, scientists look at something called the North Atlantic Oscillation, or the NAO. Basically, this is the sea level pressure difference between Iceland and the Azores. And the impact of this pressure system? It is absolutely staggering. When the NAO is positive, we get a vigorous, super powerful jet stream that drives intense storms right into Europe. But when it's negative, those winds get blocked, completely altering the weather patterns. So how exactly do we see an ancient wind system in a chunk of peat? It actually comes down to a really simple chemical equation, bromine equals sea spray, which equals storms. By measuring the concentrations of atmospheric bromine trapped in the peat, scientists can calculate exactly how much sea spray was getting kicked up by violent waves. When they pair that with something called Meyer surface wetness, which basically just measures how decayed the peat is, they can literally track the ancient intensity of these massive North Atlantic storms. It shows us how they shifted over thousands of years, constantly rewriting the human environment.
All right, moving on to part 2, Meso-landscapes shaping medieval England.
Let's zoom in a bit from giant Atlantic storm systems down to the rolling hills of the British Isles and see how the landscape fundamentally structured society. For a long time, the traditional historical narrative was that warrior elites and lords just dictated where towns were built. But the environmental record? It tells a completely different story. The environment was quietly forcing the hand of medieval settlers through very specific variables. We're talking local climate variations, the exact types of soil, higher rainfall on western boulder clays, changing topography, river systems, and, crucially, the availability of groundwater. To put that into perspective, just think about how groundwater dictated where people lived. We have what are called champion landscapes, where everyone lived tightly packed together in these nucleated villages. Why? Because groundwater was super scarce, so everyone had to cluster around a few reliable sources. Contrast that with woodland landscapes, which were really spread out and dispersed. And why was that? Because well water was easily available pretty much everywhere. So instead of some top-down, planned village moment dictated by a medieval lord, mere access to water created entirely different societal structures from the bottom up. And water actually dictated cultural borders, too. Rivers were the vital arteries of the ancient world. When archaeologists map out the spread of distinct Anglian or Saxon artifacts, or even cremation cemeteries, they find that these cultural markers align way closer to natural river watersheds than to any known political borders or top-down decrees. Nature was literally drawing the map. Okay, finally, part 3, Micro-Roman Britain's bug problem. Let's adjust our microscope all the way down. We are going from Atlantic storms to English rivers, all the way down to a highly localized, honestly kind of gross daily reality in Roman Britain. Take a look at this map. All across Britain, Roman soldiers and civilians were battling a microscopic but totally devastating threat to their survival. It wasn't rebellious tribes that were their most constant enemy. It was the greenery weevil. This little guy, the granary weevil, arrived with the Roman occupation, curiously vanished during the Dark Ages, and then returned in the High Medieval period. While the Romans were there, these resilient pests were an absolute nightmare for the grain supply. To give you an idea of the scale, they accounted for up to 90% of all beetle remains found in some Roman grain stores. No way, right? The problem was so immense that it forced the Romans to find clever, systemic ways to dispose of spoiled food, just to keep their settlements running.
And to figure out how they manage this, environmental archaeologists use a sort of forensic case file to track how the infested grain was moved through various layers of settlement waste. We can literally trace the distinct pathways from the central grain store out to deliberate disposal methods, all the way down to its accidental incorporation into the permanent archaeological record. So, how exactly do you deal with a storehouse crawling with millions of bugs? Well, the Romans didn't just casually throw things away. If the infestation was severe, they buried it deep in pits or disused wells to stop reinfestation. If it was really bad, they just burned it all. But if it was only moderately infested, they repurposed it. They fed it to livestock, or, and this is wild, they used the bug-filled grain as malting waste to brew beer. I guess a few extra bugs wouldn't completely ruin the flavor of a good Roman ale. Imagine being stationed at a typical Roman fort, like the one in Carlisle shown here. We can physically track where this infested material was moved on a daily basis. We trace the grain from the central storehouses, out to the cavalry stables as fodder, through the human latrines, and finally out to the defensive ditches where waste was burned. The presence of these tiny bugs literally dictated the waste management and the daily chore structure of the mightiest military force in the ancient world.
Now for the most visceral proof of all. Believe it or not, grain pests are commonly found in archaeological cesspits. This proves, undeniably, that lightly infested grain was often just baked directly into bread and eaten by the local population. Yep, they just accepted a little extra crunch in their daily meals as a reality of living in an environment they couldn't entirely control.
All of this brings us back to how we actually know this hidden history in the first place. We certainly aren't reading about this in the memoirs of emperors. Scientists use what is called the indicator package. By combining biological and chemical indicators, like a forensic CSI team, environmental archaeologists can decode the past. They're looking at bromine for sea spray, charred plant remains from Roman brewing, insect carapaces from ancient latrines, Teffer glass shards, and peat humification to track climate change. Together, these incredible indicators reveal an entire layer of human history that the traditional history books completely missed.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I really want you to think about what we've uncovered today. From massive Atlantic storms altering societies to the availability of groundwater drawing our maps, all the way down to tiny beetles dictating the diet of an empire, look around your own city today. Think about where your water comes from, or the weather patterns right above your home, and ask yourself, what hidden natural forces are secretly writing your history right now? Thanks for joining me, and keep questioning the world around you.